and here we are getting started with our new syllabus outline. So I hope you got your assignment done okay, and I hope you're staying safe. This chapter can be a little bit, it's not something everybody aims for, but it does occur quite frequently, and that is divorce. Now, divorce is one of the most common deviations from the traditional family life cycle. Now, for instance, children are not more likely than any other generation in the past to have parents living in separate households. It's more than it's ever been. Now, many of you will have experienced divorce either in your own nuclear family or through other relatives or friends. Now, this chapter examines the social factors that help explain why some couples divorce. Then we're going to look at the process, the stages, if you will, of divorce, which include planning a breakup, separation, and reorganization of the family or the formation of a new family. Now, this process can produce psychological and practical crises, and we'll look at those. An increasing number of children live through the dissolution of their parents' marriages, and this experience has a variety of repercussions for their development. Now, this chapter also covers the important issues of custody, child support, and post-divorce parenting arrangements. So let's start with a little bit of some history and an exploration of where we currently stand in relationship to the state of divorce in Canada. Now, by definition, squeaky desk, sorry, I have to stop leaning. Divorce is a legal disillusionment of a marriage. Now, divorce is the most common deviation from a traditional family cycle. There are other deviations, but divorce is the most common. Divorced families add 2 to 3 phases to the life cycle. Now, we've talked about a life cycle. You grow up, you establish your sense of identity, you move away from your family, you meet somebody, you establish a romantic and long-term relationship, you get married, you have kids, and so on. There's a cycle of stages, if you will. Well, divorce can add 2 or 3 to the cycle. You'll have the separation, the remarriage potentially, or stabilization into the new family and the new family patterns. And each of these have their own headaches, hiccups, and successes. So divorce is not uniform. It's not static across the board and should not be oversimplified. In practice, the divorce experience is quite diverse for couples and their families. It's not like everybody goes through exactly the same experience or enter into a divorce for exactly the same reasons. So let's consider the history of divorce in Canada. Divorce has not always been common. In early Canada, laws for divorce were strict and divorces were infrequent. Church was the dominated the social life of Canadians at the time in early Canada, and it forbade divorce. Between 1840 and 1968, that's about 100 years, 128 years, federal government had exclusive authority over divorce. Men needed to prove adultery by their wife. Women needed to prove desertion, which was 2 years or longer, known as the poor man's divorce at the time, or extreme mental and physical cruelty. And that was the reasons for divorce initially. And it came from Confederation onward. Anyone living in the province without a divorce court could submit a private member's bill to Parliament. Could you imagine needing to go to government to get a divorce? If it was passed, divorce was granted. It was a long process, and it was an expensive process. From 1925 on, women could get a divorce based on proof of adultery only. Now, a lot of the influence through this period of the early 20th century onward through this 1925 and on was the role and influence of the feminist movement, in particular by the famous 5. And I have an image of the 5 women there who were instrumental in women getting a vote, women being seen as human, and having the ability to vote, to own property, And so this was a huge shift. Now, immediately after World War II, the divorce rate jumped, resulting from, freedom, financial independence that women began to experience in the workforce while men were at war. It also divorce was influenced at this time because of a number of hasty wartime marriages. And with that long separation, sometimes marriages didn't work out. Now, with the relaxing of the church's position on divorce, divorce was beginning to be seen as a more acceptable solution to marriage breakdown. Because it's not like marriages were all successful in the past, back to Confederation. It was just that divorce wasn't an option. Either you just sort of picked up and left, and that had its own problems, or you just stuck it out and worked harder. Changes in the divorce law in 1968. This was the introduction of the no-fault principle while maintaining there was still some fault, adultery and cruelty, and it was available to both men and women. And that was one of the big pushes, big spike in divorces was that divorce law in 1968. The other spike was in 1985. And this is where they had reduced the waiting periods by granting divorces 1 year after 1 year of marriage breakdown. So if you had moved out or had indicated that the marriage broke down and it's been for 1 year, that was the main impetus for divorce. So there was another spike after 1985, and that increased the divorce rate quite higher. Now I'm using the term divorce rate. The divorce rate, it's a measure that predicts the proportion of couples that can be expected to divorce before their 30th wedding anniversary. So it's based on cultural patterns of divorce. And so, of course, that would vary from country to country, culture to culture, ethnicity to ethnicity, largely based on what is normal in their cultural experience for divorce or not divorce. So, why people divorce? We're going to look at this, why do people divorce, and also look at the sociological perspectives and how they view divorce. Now, we can consider why people divorce by getting their perspective or stating reasons, or we can consider the social causes that might underline these statements. So we might be able to get personal, subjective point of views as to why people divorce, but we also might understand that there are underlying social pressures. Now, it reminds us, if you remember back to week 1, when we looked at the introduction to family sociology, I also looked at the introduction to sort of sociology, and most importantly, your sociological imagination. So this ability to sort of see that there are personal issues that contribute to your own circumstances. Maybe I wasn't a very good husband, and therefore the marriage broke down. Or there could be social elements or public issues. The economy is tough. You might be interested to see what occurs. They're predicting a higher rate of divorce during our self-isolation during coronavirus, is that it's more people spending more time than they've spent together for a while, and not being able to get away may produce more conflict and more anxiety and more stress associated with what we're going through could increase more marriage breakdowns. The study of Canadian attitudes to divorce found 3 kinds of reasons for divorce, and I put them up in the slide behind me there. There's the fundamental issues like infidelity and abuse, and you'll see some other examples there. There are experiential issues, and these are disagreements and unsatisfactory sex life. And then there is fertility issues, like infertility and the desire to have children. Now, I'm aware that I may have said infertility twice. I'm going to correct that the fundamental issues, the first one is around infidelity and abuse. The fertility issues is around infertility or the desire to have children. Now, those 3 major divorce areas, fundamental, experiential, and fertility, are the 3 main categories as to why people divorce. Now, ethnic groups and religious denominations, they may handle divorce, the hows, the whos, the whens, for their own groups. Now, there are social factors that increase the likelihood of divorce, like the following. Those who marry before the age of 20 are more likely to separate. Now, it's important to note, before I go on to the rest, these aren't guarantees. These are just tendencies or trends given what happens in our real life. And these are just being fed back to us sort of as these are some of the explanations based on what we've observed through the data. Excuse me, coffee. There we go. So those who marry before 20 are more likely to separate later. Lower socioeconomic status is related to higher divorce rates. So certainly, and we'll revisit this, how much money you make, or your income status and your education have a big influence. And that's where this sort of lower socioeconomic, the more education, the likelihood is the more income. Therefore, the more education, the more income. Those two things become important. Cohabitation is the third. Cohabitation before marriage increases the likelihood of divorce. And fourth, spouses whose parents have divorced more likely to be divorced themselves later in their own lives. Now, the sociological perspectives, they explain divorce subtly to dramatically different. Now, the structural functionalist group, remember, this is the traditional, and they view family structure, the family structure that is preferred, is men provide the economic support and women provide the emotional and personal care. So each has functions in the structure of family. So culturally now, marriage and divorce is changing. And these changes affect the ease of getting a divorce and the stigma associated with divorce. So as much as the structural functionalists see family as having two functions in terms of the husband and wife, divorce reduces that. One, they may not be able to produce children on their own, which is one of the major functions of family. But the other thing is the support that they provide for the family and the income, the economic support, has been divided. And so part of this has been a change with the structural functionalists with the advent of more and more people getting divorced. So there's less and less stigma because more people. When I was growing up, it was unusual to see people get divorced. This was in the 60s. But when I went through a divorce myself, it was not as uncommon. And so we start to see that there's less stigma associated with it because more people know more other people who have had a divorce. The feminists, as a second group, then they address the unequal power distribution in a family between husband and wives. A woman, they become more independent with the education and careers, and they have more opportunities and more freedom that avoids the abuse and oppression that they've experienced. And again, it comes back to education and income or careers. And so with the feminists moving through the 60s in the second wave to increase the position of women and to see them have more equality, you see that starting to occur, that it's helping women. Divorce in some circumstances is a benefit to women to equalize the way things are in a family. If they're unequal, you can find your own way. 3, symbolic interactionalists. Now, they consider that the way couples interact with one another, their expectations for marriage, and my family and how they've experienced family and their marriage or divorce or separation or cohabitation or number of kids might be different than my wife's. And therefore, how we merge these and how we interact to find and sort of figure out how we're going to be a couple, our we-ness, that dialogue that occurs. Remember, the symbolic is face-to-face, micro. And much emphasis looks at how each participant, the husband, the wife, the child or children, how they deal with and communicate about their transitions through their lives. The more dialogue and the more quality the communication, the likelihood, the more success of the relationship. Now, the fourth one we'll look at is developmental theory. And it depends on, from them, their perspective, it depends on when the couple divorces, at what stage in the relationship, early in the relationship, midlife, old age. So what stage does it occur affects what occurs for the couple and the children. Perhaps it's easier when divorce happens earlier without children, Or divorce gets more difficult when there are children and traditions and extended families, and all of that is established. Now we have to go talk to everybody, and maybe that disconnect between extended family that we depended on is not there anymore because of a divorce. And so that has an impact on when does the divorce occur in that developmental stages. Can have an impact on what the impact is and what the experience is. So I mentioned in the intro that there's a road to divorce. Divorce are not usually a surprise or sudden. Oftentimes the decision to divorce does not usually occur in a single phase. Usually both people in the couple relationship probably know there's something not quite right, whether they could put a finger on it and whether they think it's going to be divorce or not, but both isn't so generally surprised. Now, like I said, the divorce is not something that occurs in a single phase. There are new boundaries. There's high stress. There's more changes, and there are many emotions. And we'll consider, how do families proceed through all of this and achieve their divorce, and what are the outcomes of that? So the first step is the decision. One or both recognize something's not okay with the marriage. Often this follows what is known as the divorce cascade. And what that really just means is that as there's some conflict, the conflict gets to become increased, more frequent. There becomes a serious consideration for divorce. Maybe one or the other expresses their desire. Then there's maybe even a separation, and then there's a divorce. That's the divorce cascade. Or if you will, it starts here and it works up and gets to here. But the cascade usually means down. So example, women may find a job and go back to school. This is let me just back it up to finish what I was going to mention there. This cascade can increase the likelihood of a divorce as time or process goes on. Now, people may delay separation until they consider a suitable time. Timing can be very important, particularly if a woman decides in her mind that this relationship's not working out. Then there's an important part about finding, where am I going to go? Because I may not have the house. If I'm going to leave, I'll take the kids maybe, or not, and move. I need to have a plan as to what's going on. So the first stage is decide. You have to make the decision. So some of the considerations might be, a woman may find a job or go back to school because this opportunity gives her the chance to do something like that, which can then better able to support her children maybe. Couples wait until children leave home. That's not uncommon. My parents waited until I left to go to university before they separated. Now, there was still a brother and my sister at home, but they were close to leaving as well, so it seemed like that was the impetus for that to occur. And it is for others. They don't want to affect the children. Some minority groups emphasize family ties and responsibilities above personal satisfaction. So the decisions can be variable. Now, there are more older Canadians experiencing divorce than there's ever been. This is known as the silver separation. So the first part then, make the decision. 2, plan the breakup. Now, that doesn't seem something you would forget, and yet oftentimes people just react to the circumstances. So couples must plan the breakup of the family system. They need to work out cooperatively to settle issues such as custody, visitation, finance, how we're going to tell the extended family, how we're going to parent. There's a lot of things. Now, some of that, in some people's experience, is done in the family courts. Some is done with mediators, and sometimes it's done between the couples because maybe their decisions to separate haven't got to do with any emotional sort of hate of one another, but they're willing to work together because they recognize that this breakup is between the adults and they have children, and they want to make sure their children's experience through this is as positive as it can be and not as detrimental as it's also potentially to be. Okay, and then the third, now before I jump into the third, planning process, this often doesn't run smoothly because not everyone's communicating very effectively. Many couples separate, reconcile, and do this repeatedly. Now, this introduces another term which is called boundary ambiguity. When you have your family intact, everybody knows who's who, what you do, and what your role is, and where you can go and where you can't go. When we go through separation and divorce in this process, then we're not always sure what the rules are and what the boundaries are. So it's boundary ambiguity. Roles are changing, formal involved, and other uncertainties. There's a variety of reasons, that this ambiguity makes for more stress. And then the third step is separation and family reorganization. Now, separation changes the relationship between husband and wife. The couple with children need to decide how we're going to coordinate these responsibilities as co-parents. Once you become a parent, you're always a parent. You don't stop being a parent. Now, much stress and uncertainty continues, and it can affect future relationships and life goals. Now, there are experiences through a divorce that we're going to label as crises of divorce. So, divorce produces what's called a transitional state. It's a temporary imbalance of routines, roles. You're an intact family to you being a single parent or a non-residential parent. There's a breakdown, often introduces 3 new crises. So one of the first crises is, we're going to look at 3 of them. Emotional crisis, economic crisis, and if there's children, then there's a parenting crisis as well. 3 we're going to look at. So let's review them. Thank you. Emotional crisis. Now, often couples will experience 3 aspects of an emotional crisis in divorce. There's I have to accept and mourn the loss of a marriage. Now, it might just be that the marriage was not good or the person you're divorcing is a bad person, but there's still an acceptance of and a mourning of you didn't go into the relationship thinking it was going to turn out this way or this person was this sort. And so there's a mourning of a loss of what could have been, what was at one point, and it's changed to something that is not so good. So there's that acceptance and the mourning of a loss of a marriage. And then there's a dealing with identity issues. Who am I now? Men and women both, the husband and wife both have these issues. Women go from being a couple where sometimes, at least historically, it's changing certainly, but historically a woman's identity was tied to a man. She accepted her last name. She may not have had a job or worked on her own, so she looked after the family. So that was a real big identity issue for women. Now, that identity issue might still be there for many women because now maybe they're going to recommit themselves to their own best improvement. For men, they've been dads and providers, and so when they go through separation, sometimes it's a recognition about now who am I? Especially if she marries or you get married. Now, what's my role with my children? And who are they to me? And it gets complicated. Building a new social network is the third sort of crisis of this emotional support. Some of the people that you depended on in your relationship were extended family members on either side, or common friends that as your family you had. And in a divorce, sometimes we don't get to keep all those people, or the relationship changes. And so we need to start to build a new social network to support us in our new endeavor. Now, when these are all accomplished successfully, there's potential for growth and opportunity that can result from a divorce. So during and after the separation process, individuals suffer the loss of an important relationship that often has served as a center for their lives, whether it was seen as satisfactory or not. Separation and divorce usually mean that individuals have to redefine themselves as people. With the growing number of divorced people, new social scripts are being developed about how to be a post-divorcee and successfully do so. Relationships with extended family members changes. We have limited support from our relatives with strong religious beliefs. Many long for the connection of the ex-spouse's relatives, who they no longer legally are related to, and maybe the relationship has broken down with them as well. And that can make things really difficult and allow us to have to sort of refocus. Now, Most adapt to these emotional shifts in about 2 years of divorce. Within 6 years, most have built reasonably satisfying life. It's worth noting, and it's not in your textbook, but it's worth noting that one of the first things that one should do in going through a divorce and being divorced is not to jump into another relationship. That 2-year point that was just made has more to do with the process of redefining who I am, disconnecting from that relationship in the way that it was, reforming who I am with myself, who I am with my children, whether it be father and extended. But you get yourself together and settled before starting another relationship, because starting a relationship too soon means that you bring stuff that's been unmanaged and not coped with very well into the new relationship, and that doesn't bode well for that new relationship. You'll see behind me, this is in your textbook, table 10.1, where we're looking at the patterns of adjustment to divorce, where there are 6 patterns identified, and you'll see them there behind me. Now we're going to look at the second crisis, and that's the economic crisis, and this is probably the most expensive thing you'll do, if maybe aside from buying a house. It usually means a drop in the standard of living, especially for the custodial parent, the one that has the children, and largely, in Canada at least, that's been predominantly for women. So she and he just, they separate. It's expensive because now where's she going to live? Where's she going to have the income? Because oftentimes the custodial parent is the parent with whom the children live the most of their time, and they might not have a full-time job. So it can be very expensive. The cost of support, there's lots of expense associated. It could be a new purchase of a house or rental. Much to do about that. Now, both parents are responsible for the support of their children. They may not be able to work. They may not be able to work things out with each other. However, in 1997, the federal government passed the Federal Child Support Guidelines, and these guidelines focused on the cost of raising a child, the parent's income, and the number of children. And you'll see in on page 284 at the top there what the guidelines essentially are. Now, common law separations are split between the federal and provincial governments, unlike married couples, which is predominantly federal. Then you have Indigenous people who live on reserves, and immigrant families. They do follow a different path to separation in Canada, and largely due to their cultural differences. And then the third crisis is the parenting crisis. Now, if the couple that's separating has kids, this is a very real crisis. When a family separates, new boundaries must be drawn. Old family rules and rituals no longer exist, and new ones have not yet taken their place. And so you start establishing new traditions, new routines, new boundaries. And that's an adjustment period. Each parent needs to establish a relationship with children separate from the other. There's no clear understanding of new rules of the relationship. Children likely to become victim of conflicts because that happen between parents. And we have to be very conscious that the relationship breakup is between adults. The children, unfortunately, are coming along for the ride. Divorcing parents may be unable to respond to their children's emotional needs when we're going through this period of adjustment emotionally. If we're looking after our kids' needs entirely and neglecting our own, that becomes a problem down the road. So how to balance that? We're going to look at children and divorce. Divorce transforms children's lives forever, and it affects where they live, how they interact with their parents, and if and how they will continue relationships with some of their friends that they've become familiar with. Few children want their parents to divorce as much as you think, because mom and dad argue all the time, they want a divorce. More often than not, they'd rather them to be together than apart. It seems odd. No matter how much tension there is in the marriage, children prefer not to have their parents divorced. However, is it in their best interest to remain in a conflicting environment? Well, no. And so as much as the divorce is difficult, it's preferred. Children from divorced families are at greater risk of developing problems than children in stable two-parent families. And that just makes sense, of course. But that doesn't mean that all kids in single-parented families are doing worse than stable families. Some additional sociological factors that affect some children in divorce includes the age of the child. Very young children are less likely to be affected long-term by divorce if they receive good parenting. Divorce may affect boys and girls differently. Of course, that would make sense depending upon the circumstances. Level of parental conflict pre- and post-separation impacts the adjustment more than just the absence of a parent. Conflict witnessed is difficult on kids. And so the parent being gone isn't always just better. The number and degree of life changes, access to extended family, can all be things that will affect children. And as a result, a term known as the sleeper effect has been coined. And this is a problem that emerges only after the effect of something like a divorce, where children, as they move on to young adulthood, may start having intimacy issues of their own, more in terms of the ability to disclose and to trust, because not all relationships are going to succeed. Some are going to fail. How do I know this one won't? And I might end it before it ends on, without me. So the next thing we're going to step in on here, and you'll see it in the slide behind me, this is in your textbook, stressors and protective factors. Now, the impact of divorce on children. I want you to pay attention to stressors. These are the things that will be a part of a separation and a divorce, and they can take many shapes and forms, but they will have an impact on children. And the protectors on the other side, and they are the things that we could do to provide support and what children need to protect them from these stressors. So between pages 287 and pages 289, you'll get a description of and a familiarity with stressors and protective factors. So I'll let that be on your own. Custody and parenting. Now there's two terms we should be clear about: custody and access. Custody is the term describes, this term describes where children will live and who makes the decisions about them. And then access is referring to the time the children spend with the parent they do not live with, usually the husband. The Divorce Act is what is referred to when exploring, parenting arrangements. How to do, who stays with who and for how long. Some of the issues that are considered in the Divorce Act are like decisions regarding the children's education, their health needs, and religion. Where are the children going to live? And how much time are they going to spend with each parent? How will future issues be dealt with? If future or post-secondary, any other purchases that might be made on behalf or with the child. Current standards used is that the best interest of the child is at the foremount in family law. Now, the custodial parent and child relationship becomes important. The challenges of the custodial parent trying to restructure their lives, being emotionally and physically drained while trying to do that, often children are not always able to get what they need. This can result in some issues behaviorally or attitudinally. The non-resident and child relationship, most often this is men. When the marriage is broken, men are sometimes at a loss as to how to manage their role of father because they're not there all the time. This role is defined for in the family. When it's out of the family, then how do you do what you do? What's been determined or found is that higher education and income often results in more frequent contact and overall divorce experience. Now, of course, that's relative. Now, we're going to look at the different types of custody. There's sole custody. Sole custody is, here children live primarily with one parent. The other parent, often dads, may or may not have rights to access. If they have rights to access, the term that was used to describe them frequently was weekend dads. Joint legal custody. Now, both parents have a decision-making rights. Best when both parents can effectively work together with children's needs foremost. Sole custody has been losing favor generally, with the growing interest towards shared custody. Now, shared custody, in this case, both parents are involved in the responsibility, the care, and the decision-making for the children. Now, this approach involves the time spent with children to be more equal. The result often is what's known as a binuclear family, which is the family that there is a balance of time and responsibility between the parents and their children, also spending equal time at each parent's home. The least used alternative is shared custody, is called what's known as the bird's nest arrangement. And it makes perfectly good sense when you hear that term, bird's nest arrangement. Here, the children are in the home, the nest, if you will, and the adults, the parents, will fly in and stay with the children in the family home for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time, and then go out, and the other parent will come in. Not unlike parents feeding the babies in a nest. That's why it's known as the bird's nest arrangement. Now, this has become more popular in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And then there's split custody, and here the parents divide custody on their children. For example, the mother may claim the daughters and the husband may claim the boys. Now, that's not particularly common, but sometimes that worked best within family dynamics for some families. Now, what are some of the factors determining custody? Well, for the most part, social norms and changes in legislation are influential in determining custody. Shared custody is most often the decision when parents have higher education and income. Child support, these guidelines are set out by the Federal Child Support Guideline, and they determine how much is paid by whom, and that's essentially those guidelines. Now, as far as the future is concerned, well, predictions are that at least half of all marriages are going to be dissolved through divorce. The implication on how best to ensure the healthy development of children living in a divorced families becomes paramount. Children tend to do best when they have continuity in their relationships and have regular contact with both parents and extended families. And we see the direction of divorce going to accommodate that as best as possible. Children also need to be assured of adequate financial support so that their needs can be taken care of. Achieving this demands serious commitment of both parents to the welfare of the children. It also requires effective enforcement of laws and backup, and we see that that does occur, and it adjusts periodically. Children's best interests are served if parents receive adequate backup from extended families and society as a whole. If left to do everything alone, the phenomenon of single parent burnout is going to continue to occur, and the implications on children will continue to be there. All right, there we are. We're done this week looking at divorce. We have 2 more content pieces I'll put up for week 12 and 13. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're having some success within this COVID-19. Keep to yourself and sequester, if you will. So wash carefully, wash frequently, and be safe. Bye now.